former president of Egypt. And we're going to focus on both the politics of the situation and also on, since our expertise, a lot of us at least, is media, on the role that various media mechanisms have played throughout all this. The panel, and I appreciate everybody agreeing to do this, I'll just introduce them very briefly, and then I'll make a couple of quick comments, and then I'll turn to Jeff, and then we'll just sort of work around the table, and everybody will have a chance to talk, and we very much look forward to questions from you. Jeff Cowan, on my right, is the director of the Center on Communication, Leadership, and Policy. Geneva Overholser is the director of School of Journalism. Laurie is at the School of International Relations. Sandy Tolan is a professor here at Annenberg and author of an excellent book, The Lemon Tree, about Israel and Palestine. Lydia Marcos, we are very proud to say, is an alum of our Master's in Public Diplomacy program and currently resides in Cairo and was there for the first few days of events there, and will be telling us about that. Right here, he's aged not so well, is Jeremy Curtin, or he will be when the tech people provide. He's a senior fellow at the Center on Communication, Leadership, and Policy, and he's also the former coordinator of the Bureau of International Programs at the U.S. Department of State. We also have with us Callie Schweitzer, who is the editor of Neon Tommy, which is the great Annenberg online product. Let me just make a couple of quick introductory comments. First off, the matter of semantics. This is not the Facebook revolution or Revolution 2.0. It's the Egyptian revolution. And it's not the Lotus revolution, it's the Tunisian revolution. There's a tendency, particularly in the West, to try to label things with our labels. And I think it's very important to show the respect for the people who are actually out there in the streets in both these countries and elsewhere in the region, and not try to put an artificial label on them. Certainly the events today are a triumph for the Egyptian people, and I think before we award the Facebook people the Nobel Peace Prize, we should probably award it to millions of people in Egypt who have been out in the streets, and those in Tunisia, and those in Yemen, and those in Jordan, Algeria, and elsewhere. I would argue, coming from my political science background, that these are the most important events since 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down. I think it is a truly transformative moment in international affairs, and I think when people will look back on this, the events of the past few weeks, the same way they look back at the fall of the Berlin Wall. We're going to focus, as I said, particularly on media, particularly the interaction between media and politics, both current and prospective, because this isn't over. Either for Egypt or for the rest of the region, or for that matter, the rest of the world. And I think we'll be seeing people in other parts of the world taking heart from what has happened in the Middle East. And the precedent for that is it is not wholly coincidental, or not coincidental at all, really, that the fall of the Berlin Wall and the changes in Europe happened only a few months after people saw what was going on in Tiananmen Square. And so these sorts of things have impact that certainly transcends borders. So the major questions we'll be looking at include the regional and global affairs in terms of the awakening to new manifestations of media influence and the changing shift in politics. Now, Callie, I know you've got to leave very quickly to go do journalism. We'll sit here and talk about it. So I'll let you give just tell us quickly what Neon Tommy's been doing, and then we'll go to Jeff.
Sure. For the past 18 days, Neon Tommy has really been in war reporting lockdown zone, reporting on everything that Egypt has been doing. And we have a staff of about 250 volunteers, and Not all of them are interested in things like Egypt, and yet we've had a great number of people get involved and find a way to make it suit their interests or find an angle that interests them. We've spoken to experts like Laurie and had podcasts and slideshows and video and all sorts of things. And today we have a few reporters heading down to do video and audio of the Egyptian consulate, a group of people meeting at the Egyptian consulate at 4 p.m. And right now we're downstairs getting everything we can get up with experts, with original reporting out in LA, with national news, international news, reactions across the web. So it's been really incredible. Our work has been linked to by Al Jazeera, the Huffington Post, really all over the place. And it's always such an amazing honor to say that as a group of students, we're competing in the mainstream media, doing everything that we can to prove that there's no such thing as a student journalist. Everybody's in the same field. We're all learning and doing what we can on the go. Yeah, this is some of our site, and I guess you can click around and get the homepage is entirely covered with Egypt stuff. It's actually just changed since it was up 1 minute ago, so my staff is doing their job. But we've had a great time on Twitter and Facebook and everything, connecting with people in Egypt directly, and it's been an incredible learning lesson, something that is really just a testament to the school and the resources that we have here and the support and the ability to do real journalism while attending Annenberg.
Okay. Thank you very much. And this real-time journalism that you're doing affects a lot of other things, and we're getting into that. Jeff, my co-chair here.
Can I just say that I was online the other day looking at the Al Jazeera blog, just looking at a minute by minute. Said, here's an interesting piece by Neon Tommy. I'm like, yeah! Nice job.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you
good
so
work.
much. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Phil, go do it, Kelly. Phil, thank you for organizing this, and your colleague Shireen, who actually has an Egyptian background, so there's a special connection here with the public diplomacy program and center. And thanks to Lauren Schultz, who actually had the idea. She said, why are we not the place that the conversation is going on about this? And she immediately turned to the Center of Public Diplomacy, and you guys jumped in to do this. And Phil, in case there's some people who don't know it, this is an area you've been writing about and thinking about a great deal with all the media in this region for a long time. And I hope we'll hear your voice in this quite a bit. Phil asked me to talk a little about how American international broadcasting, I think about this issue. Most of you know that I used to run the Voice of America and was in charge of the international broadcasting operation for the rest of the United States government. You referenced Tiananmen and the fall of the Berlin Wall 20 years ago, and it was just a little more than 20 years ago. People there in the streets were listening to the Voice of America, or listening to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And we know the stories at the time were about how they had their transistor radios at that point to their ears as they were out in the street, listening to the Voice of America, listening to Radio Free Europe, listening to Radio Liberty. And there was a tweet that I found online this morning that talked about how yesterday, when people were in the streets with Mubarak, not leaving, of course now that's changed, but the tweet said everybody had a radio to their ear. My question is this: was there anybody there who was listening to the Voice of America? Certainly they weren't listening to the Voice of America in Arabic. Why? Because you know what? There is no Voice of America in Arabic. A few years ago, Voice of America in Arabic was eliminated. In its place, what was created was something called Radio Sawa, which is a mixture of music and news. I don't know, maybe they're covering the news heavily now, but they don't have that same reputation. And Al Hurra, which we put a lot of money and resources into, maybe they're watching Al Hurra, but I have not been able to find any indication that the source of news that matters there today is Al Hurra. It's Al Jazeera. It's Al Arabiya. It's not Al Hurra. The United States international broadcasting is not a factor in what's going on in the Middle East. Now, what would we be saying if we were a factor? In my opinion, and by the way, VOA is doing some good reporting, and if you look online, you'll find VOA is doing some very good reporting in the field. But if we were a factor, we will be covering this hopefully with balance, with integrity, comprehensively, and with the highest degree of credibility. We would not be presenting an American slant to it. This is an important point, Bill, because the goal of the Voice of America has not been, and by charter is not allowed to be the mouthpiece of the American government. Its function is to be an accurate, balanced, comprehensive source of news. Why? Because it's believed that it's in the long-run interest of the United States to have the people in the streets listening to the Voice of America and thinking, this is a source of news we trust. This tells us something about America. Whatever the president's doing, whatever the Secretary of State's doing, whatever the U.S. military is doing, good, bad, indifferent, the people have in their minds that international broadcasting originating from the United States is a source that they can trust. And this morning when we saw troops going to the state-run television and saying, you're a part of the problem, wouldn't it have been nice if they were saying, and the Voice of America is part of the solution.
Thank you. Geneva?
Well, before I take on my typical grousing media critic role, which is essentially not quite what Phil asked me to do, they asked me to think about the coverage of this revolution from the U.S., in the U.S., and I want to do that. But before I do that, I want to say what all of us are feeling, which is all of us who have lived through this, whatever media we were consuming, have found this a moment that is just astonishing. Emotionally engaging in every way, obviously historic. So whatever the filter of the media we are using, I think every human being felt the way we do rarely, sort of that we are as one witnessing something that is affecting all of us. And so I'm glad to hear you said what you said about this surely strikes me as transformational. Okay, that being said, the U.S. media did what we often do, which is many of the media, and of course I'm always yelling at other people for saying the media as if they were monolith. The media is plural for a reason, right? There are all kinds of media, some of them very good, some of them no good at all, but as a generalization, it probably is fair to say that we did what we usually do, which was be pretty U.S.-centric. So we heard a lot and read a lot about, what does this mean for us? There was a good salon column on this that mentioned, for example, the Time magazine piece on what the U.S. loses if Mubarak goes. Chris Matthews demanding to know who our guy in Egypt is, and this kind of thing, which is very, very U.S. media typical. I came across an Al Jazeera inside story that looked at this issue, and it said, is U.S. coverage of Egypt commercialized and U.S.-centric? And it's kind of like, is it Hope Kaplan? Is it atavistic and superficial? It's an important time for us to understand that what American readers and viewers and listeners are getting is something we all should be worried about to a degree. I was on the Larry Mantle show talking about whether or not Al Jazeera should be available to us in cable as cable subscribers. And one fellow called up and said he started live streaming Al Jazeera because he was so sick of listening to Cooper Anderson's self-glorification without having been roughed up by protesters. I will say, there were clearly some highlights, and of course, neither I nor any other single consumer can cite them, but I know several people talked about Christian Amanpour on ABC having some very strong reporting, including a good interview of El Baradei. And the NewsHour, NPR, I certainly heard some very strong reporting, at least illuminating to me. All this, though, comes in the context of essentially continuing weakness in foreign affairs reporting, except for, crisis. And one question is, now that we have all gathered around the same hearth to see this, will we quit paying attention? If those of us who argued that, of course, Al Jazeera ought to be available on cable, succeed, will there be anyone listening? Will there be enough people viewing it to justify their decision commercially? This is, of course, the more we give people rich and interesting media, the more the answer becomes yes, because we become familiar with topics I don't feel incapable of appreciating. But the question does remain. One thing that struck me, the LA Times had more Egypt coverage than any American newspaper. And this was certainly a time when they were that was affirmed, because I bet LA Times readers, at least the faithful ones who read a lot, knew more about Egypt than the average American metropolitan newspaper reader. The one thing, of course, always to keep in mind is news coverage versus punditry. I mean, I think if you really looked at the news coverage, certainly I, as a reader every day of the New York Times and the LA Times, I got some of the U.S.-centric, but I also got important issues raised and questions discussed. I saw a wonderful cartoon, I'm sure some of you did as well, I wish I could recall. I bet it was in the Sunday New York Times last Sunday. And it was three pundits sitting there, with just very snippy looks. And they were talking about something like global warming, and they had these stop, well, as I predicted, and then the next one goes, if only people would listen to me, kind of stuff. And then the little voice off stage goes, okay, now we're going to talk about Egypt. And the little faces look at one another laugh. And then the next panel has them saying exactly the same thing as I predicted. So obviously, everybody's readiness to discuss what they do and do not know anything about is apparent. Two other topics which I think my colleagues are going to address but fall under this. It is very interesting to think about the degree to which American news consumers did consume Al Jazeera. I really haven't seen firm figures on how many people did, but clearly there was did you see the LA Times ad, Al Jazeera, this is its moment, quoting all these people saying, this is...
And KCT actually ran it.
It runs it every day at 4 and 11 p.m., KCT, which is an important note. Thank you for raising that. I would like to hear more about that. I know you will be talking about Al Jazeera. And then, of course, the debate over how much... what was the effect of social media? There was a debate within the Sunday New York Times a week ago. I mean, it's all you just read the same. We had Frankfurt saying, no, that's ridiculous, overstate that, and Tom Friedman saying clearly it was important, and some news stories saying, 20,000 Twitter accounts, but they're the influentials, and so who knows about that? And I look forward to hearing more about it. So it doesn't make any sense. I'm going to discussion.
Laurie, tell us about Egypt.
Okay, so I'm going to just say a little bit about the Egyptian media, a little bit about the Arab media, and then just some larger things. I am a political scientist, not a media person, so I'll sort of end with some things that I think are important. People are going to be addressing this region as we go forward. I think the Egyptian media, like other media in authoritarian regimes, is subservient to the regime. And there's some particularly striking examples of that. One which occurred before the outbreak of these recent events, which showed where Mubarak had been photoshopped. It was a picture of a meeting dealing with Arab-Israeli peace, Palestinian-Israeli peace, and Mubarak had been walking sort of in the second row or behind, and then he was photoshopped to be the leader in the group, and when that got out, that went viral, and it's very embarrassing for the state media, which I think probably said, well, that this was a representation of reality, but not reality. But more recently, with the beginning of these events, the fabrications of stories, the degree to which the official media did its best to try and, I think, discourage people from becoming involved, to lead them to believe that these were not large demonstrations, preventing the same line as government spokespeople, that these were terrorists, that these were saboteurs, that these were radicals that were involved. It's sort of al-Ahram, once a very venerable institution, I think sunk to its lowest point ever. There was one picture a couple of days ago where they had clearly a picture of anti-regime demonstrators, and the line was, thousands of people to support Mubarak or something like that. It was unbelievable. It really makes I think the only parallel is probably the line that the Egyptian media did during the 1967 war. So it was as you probably know, the government did the best it could to try and prevent people from getting access to Al Jazeera, but other stations were willing to host Al Jazeera, so that didn't work. That actually backfired. Al Jazeera reporters were prevented from following stories up until yesterday, I think, and then they finally came back online. But as one person said, Al Jazeera has 80 million reporters here in Egypt. So that you didn't have to be an official reporter. They were talking, they were giving feeds and by phone and so on. So it really didn't make a difference, and in fact, backfired against the government. Then there were several key developments that actually led to the turning of a number of important people as well as important institutions within the official media against the government. I think one of the key ones was the killing by sniper of an al-Ahram reporter. That seemed to turn the tide, I think, in al-Ahram as an institution. Then there was outrage by members of the Journalists Union over some very strong pro-government statements that were made by the head of their union. He was ultimately forced on, it was a couple of days ago, he was taking an open-ended vacation from his position. But this was the case in all unions in Egypt, all official professional unions in Egypt. You either had to be a member of the party or at least willing to toe the party line in order to hold these positions. So this the Journalists Union was not an outlier in that regard. So you had increasing resignations by government journalists, but finally I think the government lost control of the message. That was quite clear. There was the interview that Mona Shazli did with What of the Name, which was, I'm sure many of you may have seen it, and they provide an English translation at the bottom, which apparently was quite influential in at least getting some, helping to maintain the momentum of the demonstrations after last weekend when it appeared that things might diminish. Also important, apparently, from reports were media reports of the Mubarak family's tremendous wealth. Whether they're true or not, the reports that the family apparently has resources of $70 billion made it into the anti-regime chants and played some role in getting additional people out in the street for the last couple of days. Then, of course, yesterday after Laurie's speech, people were completely outraged, and then you had the besieging of the radio and TV headquarters, preventing people from entering and leaving, and of course, he left today. So there was a gradual process of journalists in Egypt who moved up, reasserting themselves as professionals as that space opened as the demonstrations got larger. So I think that's an important development, not only for Egypt, but also for what we might see in other Arab countries. In terms of other media, the only one I want to comment on is what's sometimes called the other pan-Arab media outside of Al Jazeera, which is basically the Saudi financed media. So we really shouldn't call it the pan-Arab media. It's the Saudi financed media, and we're really clear about that, because that message was obvious in a number of ways over the last several weeks. Saudi Arabia had a vested interest in making sure the Mubarak regime not fall, and so its messages paralleled the Egyptian state messages fairly closely. They were obviously trying to help Egypt battle Al Jazeera through their own media, whether it's Al Arabiya or Sharq al-Awsat or whatever it is. But anyway, these things, I mean, Phil will talk about this more later, but I mean, the battle was won by, I mean, Al Jazeera played such a critical role in this revolution, and I don't think you can understand it. All right, just a couple of other points then that I think come out of this, what is, I think, a transformational moment. We don't know where it's going. As somebody who studies Middle East politics, it's really hard to point to events that make one enthusiastic or hopeful, and this is one. So let me just say a few things about what I think this means going forward for people who are going to be addressing their messages to the region. First of all, this revolution, the Tunisian revolution before it, and now the Egyptian revolution, has clearly restored a sense of dignity to a lot of Arabs. You can hear people interviewed on the street saying, this is the first time in X number of years that I felt proud to be an Arab. As Shibli Talhami was saying this morning, I heard him interviewed, it's hard to think about the last time that was the case. It may have been when the Egyptian army broke through the Bar-Lev line in 1973, but it may have been as long ago as 1956 when Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company. Today they are, and that's a major difference. I think along with that then is either what I would call a revival or perhaps a renewal or a reconstructed sense of Arabism in the region. So it's time for Fuad Ajami and all of his buddies to write, they can stop writing about the death of Arabism, because the idiom of the people is very much Arab, I think. The role of Tunisia and Egypt's revolution makes clear the importance of Arabism as a shared identity, which isn't to say being Tunisian isn't important, isn't to say being Egyptian isn't important, but this sense of Arabism clearly resonates and has had power in the events of the last several weeks, and I assume it will be going forward in other places. So I think this is the beginning of a new stage in perhaps the history or the experience of Arabism. And then finally, I'd say that this revolution is likely to restore Egypt to its centrality in Arab politics, which it had lost. The last few years in particular, Egypt's role has basically been reduced to that of security enforcer for the United States and Israel. This is not the role that Egypt played in the past. This is not the role that Egypt played as the center of Arab politics, culture, education, and so on going forward. It was an increasingly diminished role, and that was basically Omar Suleiman's role, and he was the key enforcer. In that, the fact that he's gone is a very hopeful sign, I think. When there were recent crises in the Middle East, Egypt played less and less of a role. I mean, instead you would have media, you had Qatar, you had Syria, you had Saudi Arabia, but not Egypt participating in these things. And that, again, a major change from the 1950s and 1960s. So I don't see Egypt withdrawing from any of its major international obligations, like the Treaty with Israel, but I think that it will carve out a new tradition or it will carve out a new path from what was pursued under the Mubarak regime. I don't think you're going to have an Egyptian regime, for example, that's going to be destroying tunnels from Gaza over the next period. So this is going to be an Egypt that I think will reassert itself as a key, but more independent, and therefore I think more authentic actor in regional politics. It's going to be back with a new confidence, with a new dignity, and I think also as an inspiration to other Arab actors.
Thank you very much. Well, Sandy, you've studied what's going on in Israel and Palestine, and of course, there's been debate even within Palestine about this, that the Palestinian Authority is leaning one way and Hamas another. What sort of ripple effects are we likely to see?
Well, it's interesting that Laurie was talking about Arabism as a shared identity and the possible ripple effects on Israel and Palestine. I think I don't want to do too much of a political analysis because I want to talk a little bit about social media, although there's a lot less to talk about in the case of the Palestinians in particular, for reasons I'll share. But I think my analysis is that Israel really has lost its chance for a two-state solution because the two large settlements were, if you look at Palestine papers, that were really an issue that could have been a chance for a deal if it wasn't involved in a lot of Yemen and the settlement of Ariel. Without going into a lot of details, it's 55,000 people. Israel would not budge, the Palestinians would not budge. And as a result, in 2008, the deal fell apart. And I think now, in light of the revelations of the Palestine papers, which have made a lot of people, a lot of Palestinians furious and enraged that they were already giving up too much. After Cairo and after Tunis, I just don't see that Humpty Dumpty getting put back together. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. Now, there hasn't been, both in terms of social media and in terms of action on the street, a lot of activity over the last couple of weeks. So why is that? Well, as the people across the Arab world, across the world were celebrating, demonstrating, obviously millions of people in the street in Cairo and elsewhere in Egypt, the Palestinian Authority made the choice to begin demonstrations in support of the Egyptian and Tunisian people. Why is that? Well, partly because the Palestinian Authority has been structurally tied to the U.S. peace process with Mubarak as a key player. And so they were banning, one of the comments from one of the security chiefs of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, was the policy is non-interference in the internal affairs of Arab and foreign countries. So you didn't see much. You saw some band demonstrations, you saw people getting beat up, then they actually bust people in for a pro-Mubarak demonstration, which was allowed to take place. So the credibility of the Palestinian Authority, which was already at an abysmal level, is now such that a lot of people are anticipating it's actually going to collapse. Now, people have said that for a long time. I don't necessarily think that would, some people think it would be a good thing. Some people think it would be a terrible thing, but its credibility is no longer seen as really representative of Palestinian aspirations. It hasn't been for a long time. But after these events, including the revelations in the Palestine papers, it's probably not going to, it may not survive. Now, if that happens, some people are forecasting that there would be a reoccupation, a full, Israel already occupies 60% of the West Bank in military occupation, but there's some, I think what's going to happen now post-Cairo is people do not, there's a lot of mixed feelings about Palestinians rising up against their own people, even if it is the Palestinian Authority. But if the Palestinian Authority is no longer in control, then Israel does reoccupy the entire West Bank. It's obviously too early to say that. But given that the two-state solution to me looks just about dead, you could see something like that happen. That's when you see more social media coming to play some sort of role. I do think that it was somewhat overstated, and I know that probably Lydia and you will talk a little bit about this, but clearly it's, when you see internet penetration at 25% in last in Egypt, 30% of people on Facebook, 1 out of 400 has a Twitter account. We need other factors at play as they were in Egypt, and people have talked a lot about that. And just the same in the Palestinian and occupied territories, you need other factors. Now that you may see those other factors, especially with the Palestinian Authority removed, as of the last couple of weeks, most of the tweets and the fairly limited social media that exists anyway, compared to other places in the West Bank, for example, in Gaza, have been simply people watching what's going on in Egypt. There's a woman who's actually here now. She's promoting a book called Gaza Mom, and she's got a blog called Gaza Mom. Her name is Leila Al-Haddad, and she's just been doing things like putting together her favorite tweets from Cairo, and I'll share a couple of them from you. The Arab Massive, this is as if it's already updated now, it's as if a couple of days ago. The Arab masses are demanding their leaders hold an emergency Arab League summit in Jeddah and never come home. America has spoken. Egyptians have a fundamental right to use, this is when there was a particular ire at some of the Obama administration's comments. Egyptians have a fundamental human right to use Twitter, and Mubarak has a fundamental right to be president of Egypt. And then finally, Mubarak is not a dictator, sure. And denial is not just a river in Egypt, which is probably so I think I'll stop there, but except to just add that one of the things that we know is social media is not just used as a tool, and it has been used, of course, as a tool for activists and for organization, much in the way that text messaging was in the Philippines when the ouster of Joseph Estrada 10 years ago. But it also can be used by the state, as we know. And two of the most prominent uses of social media in the Palestinian occupied territories have been from the Palestinian Authority. And I'll just read you two quick ones. This is from two AP reports. A Palestinian reporter tagged in a Facebook image that mocked the president, says he's been accused of insulting a public figure. Mamdouh Amarea of Al-Quds Television said Saturday that his prosecutors had set his first court date for next month. And then there was a blogger who allegedly insulted Islam and has been detained in the city of Calcutta. And that is from a traditionally secular institution, the PLO, now the Palestinian Authority, which is now using social media, in this case, because of supposed religious blasphemy, or for organizing against the Palestinian Authority. So you're seeing that as a tool of repression.
Thank you, Sam. Lydia, you were in Cairo during the first days of the demonstrations. Could you give us a sense of what it was like there? And also, particularly, what media sources, news sources, do people rely on? How are they using social media?
So while I was there for about the first week of the protests, and obviously you guys know the state of how everything was because the media coverage, in terms of coverage, was very accurate. And I think you'll hear through everything I say, there's going to be a difference. I think there's a big difference between media coverage versus media analysis. So I think what everybody had was media coverage with Al Jazeera Arabic, Al Jazeera English, BBC, CNN, Nile TV, whatever it is. Actually, now today very poor coverage. Every other kind of media source. However, the analysis all around the board was extremely weak and lacking, and still is. Even as of this morning, 8:30 or 8:15 a.m., when they announced that Mubarak resigned and that the army and his council of wise men were taking over. One of the first people that I heard, I was watching Al Jazeera English, and we received Al Jazeera Arabic, Al Arabiya, all other sources. But the first, I purposely watched Al Jazeera English for that, and the first analyst actually gave, in my opinion and in people who live in Egypt, many people, I think, want a very insufficient answer to what's happening, because like Laurie was saying, people don't know if this is something that we're supposed to celebrate, or people don't know if this is something that we're supposed to actually be very cautious of, because a military state is not, it's not a long-term solution. So I don't claim to be a political analyst myself, but I think it's important to ask those questions. So in Egypt, this is interesting because Geoffrey was mentioning this as well, definitely been not listening, unfortunately, most of the voice of America. The first day when everything happened, actually, not the 25th, not the day of the revolution, but the first day when everyone was on lockdown, no cell phones, nothing. I was with family friends in Heliopolis, which is where the palace is. And that day, it just so happened it wasn't because the government, but our satellite had just broken down. So all we were getting was Nile TV, and Nile TV literally was showing images of the Nile. It was very, and as you hear outside gunshots and all this stuff that's happening, so you're just really confused. And for a few hours, okay, you're like, all right, what's happening? And then it's not funny anymore because it's a whole day. You can't contact your family, you can't contact anyone in the U.S. Of course, you guys woke up to the dawn, so we had spent an entire day, 10 hours ahead. So basically, to find out what was really happening for those who didn't have satellite, which most people in Egypt actually have access to satellite, even like those people in garbage drones will have satellite dishes because it's illegal and it's easy to get, it's cheap. But ours just happened to break and it was legal. But what most people were watching was Al Jazeera, because obviously we're English. I'm actually really shocked, speaking with Shereen about this earlier. The reception of Al Jazeera ought to be in English, in English and Arabic, is they seem to be the same exact entity, even though it's not. They think it's just a translated form, and there's actually no credibility, very little credibility, I should say, in Egypt for Al Jazeera, because Egyptians have always felt, very nationalistic about being Egyptian as opposed to being Arab, even though right now it is a time of Arabization and all Arabs coming together in Tunisia and different revolts, even Iran. But it's really interesting, and just something I have to say about Al Jazeera's effect, because what ended up happening is about probably the third or fourth day into it, protesters went and looted and killed some people in the Al Jazeera office and shut it down completely. And of course it was still broadcasting and we were still getting messages, but they really felt like they were actually inciting the situation a lot more in Egypt. So that's very interesting because in the U.S., of course, and actually one of my favorite resources especially for breaking news is Al Jazeera English, but in Egypt it wasn't like that at all. So I was really shocked to see that, and I thought it was because of the analysis, because people just came out and said things from a very American perspective, very U.S. interest, which nobody cares when people are on the street and we have no internet and our phones aren't working. It's the last thing people care about, and the last thing they will care about until they have their rights reinstated. So I think it was really the rise and the dawn of Egyptian journalism, like Mona Shazali. Her interviews, before she interviewed Wright and Laurie, she interviewed different members from the Egyptian government. If you guys remember the first day when he gave literally the 28th, he came up and gave a speech and he said, fine, I'm going to abolish my government. And he released all of his government employees, and he was still the president. So she gave the next day, about a little less than 24 hours later, she had an interview with different people, ministers from the government. And it was phenomenal because no one had ever seen that kind of journalism, no one had ever seen that kind of candid, quick response to what was happening.
Where did she appear? 10 o'clock or the box in the Rasha?
Yeah.
Is it Rasha on the Saturn or something like that?
It's an Arabic independent, it's not the state news at all. It's my first time watching that station. I just walked across her. No one says she was a really famous journalist, but no one had tracked her to be, the number one leading political analyst, pretty much, of what was really happening. And I think that's the interesting thing is, I just kind of bring this conversation to the framing of the situation, the framing of what's happening in the region. I think more important than ever, and now the framing is essential because as whoever the new army, the leader, the Council of Wise Men, who constructs the Council of Wise Men? Again, earlier conversation is maybe Salutis, one of the most famous Egyptian businessmen. So it's like people in Egypt, the atmosphere and the climate in Egypt, which is great, but it's also really devastating. People are so thirsty for one leader. People are so thirsty for one answer. Which way do we go? Who is it? How do we move? And so it's definitely what's happened today. It is the dawn of the new Egypt in that people feel respected, people feel that their voices can be heard. But I think there's actually a lot more, a lot deeper places we have to go from here because people don't really know where they want to go or where they should go. So now you have people from businesses and of course different parts of government and the army really rising and saying, okay, well, let's do this. This is a good idea. Let's do this. And now the youth, there's an argument they might be a part of this Council of Wise Men who are protesting. So it's interesting.
That's a long time to be there. So, well, let me make just a couple of comments about two related areas, and then we'll toss it open to discussion. First, I take a bit of a contrarian view on the role of social media in all of this. I think when you look at the statistics and the National Endowment for Democracy just a few days ago put out a new report on this, Facebook has 17 million users in the Arab world. That's 5% of the population. Internet penetration in the Arab world, of course, it varies greatly from some of the Gulf countries, for example, to countries like Yemen. But overall, it's 20%. And according to the CIA World Factbook, there are 20 million internet users in Egypt. That's about 25% of the population. Television, on the other hand, is much more widely available. And I think what was happening, particularly in Tunisia a few weeks ago, seems like ancient history now, Tunisian revolution, was that Al Jazeera particularly, and I assume other channels as well, was serving as a kind of aggregator. That it was going to Facebook and to YouTube and to Twitter, which people were certainly using, but when Al Jazeera puts it on its air, it's going to reach a much, much larger audience. And I think it's important to recognize that although it's kind of sexy to talk about Facebook revolution, Twitter revolution, whatever, television is still the dominant electronic medium, along with radio for that matter, in the region. And so that's just worth keeping in mind. The other thing that comes to mind, and this was brought to bear, I think, when Callie Schweitzer was talking about Neon Tommy earlier, is the tremendous speed at which things are moving, and how difficult it is to be a policymaker. The Obama administration has not really covered itself in glory over the past few weeks, but I'm not sure that anybody can do this anymore. In one of my courses, I talk about the time when the beginnings of the Berlin Wall went up in 1961. There was a CBS News crew there. Their film, when it was filmed, that had to be processed after it got from Berlin to London to New York. It took 4 days to get on the air. And President Kennedy at the time had a cushion of time in which to make decisions. The Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, called him at Hyannisport and said, there's something going on in Berlin, and they talked about it a little bit, and they said, okay, let's see what develops, I'm going sailing. And Rusk said, I'm going to a baseball game, and that was it. And then at the White House press briefing on Monday, this was Sunday, there were very few questions asked about Berlin, and then the CBS piece finally made the air on Tuesday. That's so archaic now. I mean, there's no way if something comparable to the Berlin Wall went up, it would be broadcast live instantly, and the president's response would be expected to be equally instant. That's not a good thing, I would argue. When you have people, when you think about old-time diplomats like George Kennan or Dean Acheson, they'd just be horrified by the idea of making foreign policy on the run. But to a certain extent, that's what has to be done now. So I don't have any solution for this except perhaps better intelligence and anticipation. But it is something that we are now living with. There is a possibility for, in that kind of environment, for actually catastrophic misjudgments, and you hope that won't happen. But if you just, and somebody's gonna write about this in a detailed way within the next few months, but if you watch the Obama administration over the past, say, 2-3 weeks, and you see all the back and forth that they did, you might think from a distance, that's not a good way to run a government. But I would say, what would you have done? What's the alternative? How could you have handled it differently? Because you can't see the future. You're getting these news reports back and forth. You get blindsided by things like Mubarak's speech yesterday. And so it's a very difficult environment in which to work. We got Jeremy Curtin's answering machine. And the answering machine had no comment. But we might try them again in a little bit here. But so I think what you've seen is the immense complexity of what's involved here. And so let's take some. I see a lot of smart people sitting out here, and taking my students. So let's see if there's some questions.
I would like to find out about your views about the way the Muslim Brotherhood has been featured, and because in a way it's easy to think that the way we have understood it is like it's in a way it's like an enemy for American politics as well. So now in the end it's very big in Egypt. Now the power is with the army, but if they have democracy, it will have to play a big part. And in the end, is there any other alternative than Muslim Brotherhood really? Are there political groups like that are really sort of can be seen as democratic? Do we know as a media enough about it?
You want to take a shot?
Yeah, that's an essential question. I think that's a question that every single mother and child and person is asking and fearing simultaneously, whether they're Muslim or Christian. And I think the Muslim Brotherhood was actually leading one of the first press releases in organizing the protests, especially on the 25th. The mobilization of the protests and everybody came through social media and came through Facebook and Twitter. So it's a really good question. In terms of alternatives, people, again, there's a lot of conspiracy theories, but people are saying, and very much believe that Annenberg, who people thought was the opposition party alternative, is actually the face of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I can't think of any other alternatives other than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Brotherhood has played very much of a catch-up role in this, and I think that people who've been out in front, and I don't see the people who've been out in front as kind of the just sort of front people. I mean, I think that this was, for any of the established parties, Egypt has a long tradition of political parties. One of the problems, one of the reasons why you don't see more political party activity is that the Mubarak regime was that regime before you crushed them, and then Nasser before that, to be honest. So there are political parties, but they've been strangled. We have political movements in Egypt. You have the April 6th movement, you have the Kafaya movement, but these people try to put forward presidential candidates, and Mubarak threw people in jail, prevented the constitution was constructed in such a way that these people couldn't run. So Wright himself was ineligible to run had he chosen to do so under the old rules. So it has to do with the way that, and the regime has been very clever, I think, in using the threat of Islamic takeover, of a caliphate on the horizon, to paralyze Egyptians into thinking that it was the only thing, that Mubarak's authoritarianism was the only thing that stood between it and this being overwhelmed by some kind of radical Islam. If you look at the slogans of people in the street, there's nothing about Islam as a solution. These are They were anti-Mubarak, they were anti-Omar Suleiman, they were anti, being an agent of the United States, or an agent of Israel, or, just things like Get Out, or more recently, people wanted the army to intervene because they saw the army as one institution that could perhaps break the crisis yesterday. So my own feeling, obviously, Lydia and I have a disagreement on this, but, we get different analysts and different takes on things. I think that the threat of Muslim Brotherhood is greatly overblown. I actually think that once you have a more fully functioning participatory system in Egypt, you will find what the true extent of support for the Muslim Brotherhood is, which I think is probably less than what it actually got in elections, because many people who did bother to vote, and a lot of people didn't even bother to vote because they thought it was pointless, voted for the Muslim Brotherhood because it was the one sort of opposition thing. It was one way to register, no, I don't want this. So I think once you have the opportunity for parties to actually develop and not be crushed by this repressive regime, we're going to see that there really is a flourishing political life in Egypt in which the Muslim Brotherhood participates and sends some people to parliament. I don't see anything wrong with that, and I think also that's the position of the administration now as well, that they have to have a seat at the table. So we have somebody who's going to join us now.
Yes, Jeremy Curtin is now on the phone with us. And Jeremy, thank you for taking time to join this discussion. One of the things that I was talking about just a few minutes ago was how the speed of information delivery is affecting the people at the State Department and the White House. And I wonder, with your years of working at State particularly, what is the impact of this real-time news and trying to do real-time diplomacy?
Well, I should say at the beginning, I'm not with State anymore, although I was there today. It's pretty interesting sight to see with everybody focused on this particular issue, which is so momentous. But no, it does have a very big effect, and people don't have days to think about what's going on and get clearances and run everything through several layers. And one point I would make is that when something like this happens, something as big as Egypt, but even on a smaller scale, diplomacy is going on at many different levels. This new media, and I think you could point to Al Jazeera, as you have in the past, much more, in fact, than Twitter or anything like that, the social media. But it adds a layer that requires a response. So you have the Secretary of State talking to the media with the thought that it would be heard in Egypt as well as anywhere else. At the same time, she's talking to Egyptian officials, and the president's talking to Egyptian officials and other officials, and also making public statements. So there's just the whole pace of everything has increased exponentially. At the same time, our people are trying to operate in a crisis mode on the ground in Washington, at working level. They're not only trying to figure out the political moves, but they're trying to take care of the business of Americans who are stuck out there, or the concerns of Americans here who have family back there. So that sort of thing, the operations centers and task force, they're also going on. So you have this huge mix. The people at the top have to keep their focus on what's important to them, and the machine keeps going, dealing with the daily working level operations. So it is very, very demanding, very hectic.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Let's take another question from Victoria.
Well, I want to, Jeremy, one of these that we've been talking about is there was a sharp cutback, which I don't understand, under this administration in funds for civil society support. At the same time that Obama gave that great speech in Cairo, calling for democracy, the funding, and maybe Jeremy knows more about this now, we've been talking about it some lately, I think we should cut back from like $30 million to $7 million, or something like that. $30 million at the end of the Bush era, like $7 million under Obama. Very surprised to cut back for it, and every person that got money from USAID had to essentially be registered with or approved by the Egyptian government. I don't understand that, but it's one of the things I'd like to know more about.
Yeah, I can't really, I'm trying to find the answer to that, your messages. I didn't really get a good answer.
Yeah.
There's some, part of it involves dispersing of funds, but that's different from appropriating funds or assigning funds to programs. But I didn't really get a good answer from it.
So I think that's something that journalists in this room or political scientists may want to know more about. Why was that done? Was it a deal with Mubarak of some kind? Was it done for other reasons? Did it have an impact on those civil society groups? And all of a sudden, groups that have been getting a certain amount of money, now they're not getting it. Did that have an effect? I don't know. Interesting question. But I want to also address another question having to do with Muslim Brotherhood. But I don't know how to analyze this until Laurie or somebody tells me what we should think of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Is it credible?
Well, it's sort of an outgrowth of APEC, so it has a very strong pro-Israel orientation and.
So they have a poll, and I don't know if this poll is designed to comfort people in Israel. It certainly does not take an alarmist standpoint from the Israeli standpoint at all. What it says is, this is not an Islamic uprising. This is a poll of people in Egypt, and it's the first poll I've seen. Maybe there have been a lot of others, but they haven't been in the American media. So you're seeing the people on the street, but the people on the street don't necessarily constitute a poll any more than they do here when there's the Tea Party demonstrations or the anti-war demonstrations out there with a poll. The Muslim Brotherhood Friends poll is approved by just 15% of Egyptians, and its leaders got barely 1% of the vote in a presidential straw poll. As far as support for Israel was concerned, more people supported continuing the treaties with Israel than opposed it. And Al-Baradei had practically no support. The views of America and the notion of keeping good relationships with America were more positive than negative. So it's sort of interesting. I don't know how accurate that poll is, but one thing you have to wonder, we have reporters out there in the street, and this is one of the questions about the media, saying, the street is saying, well, fine. But is that what the people are saying? And if we are going toward a democratic process here, which we hope we are, it may be that the attitudes of the electorate are not exactly the same as the people who are out in the street demonstrating.
Well, sure, and that's, there's this term that keeps getting kicked around, the Arab street, which is ridiculous. It's Arab streets is what should be used, because just like there's not an American street, there are many streets. And you had maybe several million people taking part in these demonstrations, but there are 80 million people in Egypt. And so you're right, just to say, well, these people got out of the street and they represent everybody, that's not the case, Andy.
Yeah, but just to, in terms of the press coverage, I mean, other than Bill O'Reilly and Fox and O'Reilly trying to bait Obama on Super Bowl Sunday to say something about how the Muslim Brotherhood might not be that bad and wanted something to play over and over again. Obama wouldn't give it to him. But I think the coverage that I've seen other than that has been relatively measured. And to some extent, I think Turkey provides an example to the world that you can have a secular democracy in a Muslim country, and that maybe the Muslim Brotherhood is more like that than Al-Qaeda, and certainly, from what I understand, are. And I think that's being reflected somewhat, at least in some of the coverage in the Times, for example, has been fairly nuanced.
And Turkey is an interesting case, and I'll give a plug for an event we're doing next Wednesday. The Turkish ambassador to the United States is going to be here speaking at noon in SOS 250. So if you're interested in hearing from Turkey.
Yes, what's up for our Thursday event? Our Thursday event.
Thursday event, yeah.
Well, where is that going to be?
I'll have to check.
So we're doing another panel,
Yeah.
Laurie and I.
And Professor DePage are going to talk about whatever,
And I'll make a very quick comment, I promise I'll be quick, but we're talking about your concerns about making foreign policy on the fly. We're also making media on the fly, and the kind of thoughtful, assemblage of what this really means. I mean, the good news is, as you said, there are 80 million Egyptians who are reporting for Al Jazeera. That's also the bad news, and the media who are there on the street are saying what's happening on the street, and whichever Arab street. But, even the Egyptian ambassador to the UN was talking about the fact that Al Jazeera had been shut down for a while, and he was saying, it's just not effective. We all have to realize we're part of the same kind of village now. So really, the difference between the media and sort of whatever anybody is saying when they're reporting on their cell phone is really in development now. They have to recognize that when they form a conclusion.
Let me take the gentleman in the black shirt and then the gentleman in the white shirt.
You mentioned a rise in Arabism and I guess we saw like a independent Arab news station, Al Jazeera, getting comments. But today, on Reuters, they just announced that Musa was stepping down as the Secretary General of the Arab League, and we're seeing much more nationalist movements. How do you see like the whole rising against dictator thing and Arabism going along with the, I guess, shake-up in the Arab League?
By the way, he is, I think he is the person with the most support, Musa, as a possible president of Egypt. Today, at the poll in Egypt, he's the single person who has the most support.
And he was sent to the Arab League by Mubarak because he constituted a competitor for a number of years ago. So it was a way to cut their asylum. I don't know if it's interesting that that's what's reported. It's difficult to say how closely some Egyptians feel he was to the previous regime. He certainly is a prominent person.